Глубоко уважаемые коллеги, добрый день.
Distinguished colleagues, may I declare the meeting of this Thesis Defense Board open. The Thesis Defense Board today considers the thesis for the candidate of sciences in history under the title of Economic Policy of the Russian Empire in Turkestan general-governorship, second half of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. May I declare the meeting open. May I remind you to switch off your mobile devices. May I also remind you that we have an online broadcasting at the website of St. Petersburg State University, as well as simultaneous interpretation into English. First and foremost, may I note that according to the federal law of May 23, 2016, 148 on the changes into the article of the 4th federal law on scientific and technical policy of the August 1999, 127 St. Petersburg State Universities as well as Moscow State University have an exclusive right to entitle academic degrees. Altogether, academic degrees can be entitled in such academic industries. No sound into the headphones. Interpreter isn't working. No sound into headphones. Interpreter isn't working, unfortunately. Interpretation is impossible. The present meeting of the Thesis Defense Board is the first one in St. Petersburg State University and in Russian Federation, and my congratulations therefore. I have to inform you that this meeting, according to point 7, section 3, on the operation of Thesis Defense Board for candidate of sciences and doctor of sciences in St. Petersburg State University is rightful, provided that 1/3 of the approved composition participates in the meeting. Today we have all 5 members, with one of them being an international, a foreign citizen, and he's going to speak via Skype. According to point 19, section 4, on the operation of Thesis Defense Board of the above-mentioned document, today the order is that the meeting lasts not over 2 hours. First comes a short report of the chairman on the documents provided and whether those are in accordance with the requirements. Next comes the speech of the defendant. 15 minutes, questions on the report, not over 2 minutes for each question. Questions can be asked both officially by the members of the board as well as those who are not the member of the board. It is important that the speaker introduces themselves and registers with the chair. Fourth comes the reports of all the members of the board with a detailed presentations of their position, not over 10 minutes per each member. Then general commentaries of the defendant and his reply, not over 15 minutes overall. Point 6, open discussions, recommendations of those who are not members of the Thesis Defense Board with specific questions or recommendations, suggestions on the topic of research, not over 5 minutes per each speaker. May I once again remind you that all who are willing to speak have to register with the chair prior to speaking and to introduce themselves in full for the protocol. 7. The overall commentary of the defendant on the commentaries and questions. Not over 5 minutes. Then, lastly, comes the academic supervisor, and then a 5 minutes break before open voting on whether to entitle the defendant to the academic degree. This part is not broadcasted. After the break comes an open voting by names. The results will be included into the protocol with a relevant decision on whether to entitle the defendant to the academic degree. Now, a short report of the chair. The speaker isn't speaking into the mic. The thesis under consideration, Economic Policy of the Russian Empire in Turkestan, General-Governorship, second half of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, is adopted for defense according to the decree of the rector number 91/40. The thesis has been approved by the Defense Board under a relevant decree with the following composition. Arsen Karapeti Shaginan, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Professor, Department of History of the CIS countries, St. Petersburg State University. Michael Florinsky, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Professor of the Cathedral, the Department of History of Russia from the ancient times to the 20th century. Taisia Kitanina, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Professor, the Department of CIS countries, St. Petersburg State University. Sergei Abashin, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Professor, European University. Alexander Morrison, Doctor of Philosophy, Professor, the School of Humanitarian and Social Sciences, Nazarbayev University, Astana, Kazakhstan. The defendant presented into the Expertise Center the following documents. Application addressed to the St. Petersburg State University rector dating back to October 2016. The report of the academic supervisor, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Professor Daudov Abdikhakimovich. The list of publications that include 8 papers and reflect totally the results achieved, including 4 articles in the list of the Higher Attestation Commission. 4th certificate as of March 3rd, 2016, issued by the St. Petersburg State University, certifying that Mr. Alimdzhanov studied in the postgraduate department of St. Petersburg State University under the specialty of historical sciences and archaeology, and has successfully passed the following exams: history of science, foreign language, global history. Results are A, perfect. 5th, recommendation on the dissertation, on the thesis for defense. This recommendation was approved in 2016 by Mr. Tonik, the Vice Rector of St. Petersburg State University. Master's degree diploma M05726, issued in 2010, certifying that Mr. Alimdzhanov has a master's degree. 7, certificate provided by the oversight body of the Russian Federation as of October 2016 to certify that Mr. Alimdzhanov has a relevant degree that is accepted in the Russian Federation as a relevant qualification. Eighth, the thesis in Russian and in English language, both online and on paper. It is drafted in accordance with the federal standards. I should note that all the documents are in compliance with point 12, section 3, presentation of the thesis in St. Petersburg State University. Thank you very much for your attention. May I now give the floor to the defendant for a short speech. The thesis presented for defense includes the introduction, 3 chapters that comprise 7 sections, a conclusion, list of primary sources and references, and an appendix. The introduction establishes the relevance of the research for the academic tradition, objectives and goals, the time period, the methodology, references and resources, as well as originality and practical relevance. The first chapter, political economical situation in Turkestan in the second half of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, covers the reasons of the Russian invasion, as well as the administrative structure of Turkestan governorship, and economical and social and cultural challenges and solutions. The first section is devoted to social and political processes in Turkestan and covers the Russian invasion of the Central Asia, as well as the administrative structure of Turkestan general-governorship and economic policy of Russia and mid-Asian region and its impact on local population. In the second half of the 19th century, the political situation in Central Asia has changed dramatically as a result of military moves of Russian Empire. The military moves started in 1864 and were over the same year after Turkestan and Chimkent surrendered. This military activity was motivated by foreign policies of the Russian Empire. In 1863, Minister Milutin, who used to reject any military action in Central Asia, approved of the intervention so as to draw England's attention away from Poland. So once again, to draw it away from Poland, the expansion of Russian Empire has 2 reasons. First, military and political competition between Russian and British Empire in the east, and second, economical rivalry for transit trade routes. After the Crimean War, Russian Empire was able to expand southeastwards only. Britain interpreted Russian policies in Central Asia as a pursuit of going as far as British India, which was a threat for British rule. I should note that, however, that in Russian foreign policy of that time, Central Asia was a supplementary tool to facilitate policies in southeastern Europe. The Turkestan general governorship initially included 2 districts, Semirechynsk and Serdaryinsky region, with other regions, Fergan, Ermudaryinsky and Transcaspian region, emerging a little bit later. Local administration in districts was headed by local military governments who were responsible for the police as well as administrative, judicial and military power. Districts were governed by heads of district administration who concentrated all kinds of powers, acting as head judges, heads of the police, and were responsible for land and revenue policies. Locals were also involved into administration governors appointed the so-called elected exarchs in neighborhoods and communities who were the lowest class of administration. Locals were also engaged in tax collection and water distribution. Remarkably, local authorities were reluctant to promote indigenous aristocracy into administrative positions. These actions served to undermine the order existing aristocracy so as to intervene with the existing traditions. However, the local administration was not successful, and therefore they had to engage locals so as to successfully govern the nomads. The economical development of Turkestan general-governorship was a promise for the metropolis. Local administration, in its overall policies in the region, was reluctant to allocate any extra investment. However, what we see in local newspapers is that to be able to make Turkestan successful, a Russian Empire has to make some extra investments, and that would return and reward Russia. And this idea is going to echo all until 1917. Remarkably, there is an opposite viewpoint. Its advocates claimed that any interference was an impediment. Turkestan was not a Russian colony. This is what opponents of this view used to claim. This was an unparalleled phenomenon. I mean, the success of Turkestan. So Turkestan could potentially be a colony of Russia, but not now. This means that authorities were hesitant about the present and the future of Turkestan, which is echoed in newspapers and official records. This means that there were two opposing points of view. First, Turkestan is a Russian Empire colony, and it has to serve for the benefit of Russian Empire. And a different view is that Turkestan is part of the Russian Empire, and it has to serve the benefit of the local population. The second point actually dominated. The second section on the formation and development of conceptual ideas of the empire economic policy in Russia and Turkestan covers debates around the economic policy. Opinions of the two parties did not always agree. Quite often those were opposite. Authorities in St. Petersburg wanted to boost production with minimum investment and minimum expenditure. However, that was impossible. Well, at least in those times. Imperial authorities of Russia intentionally refused to invest into the economy of Turkestan without generating instant returns. And therefore, all these ideas about investment and reforms were merely declarative. I should note that Russian Turkestan was an unparalleled border region of the Russian Empire, with its local culture preserved. The second chapter, the agricultural, industrial and customs policy of Imperial Russia in Turkestan, covers relevant policies of Russian Empire in Turkestan. In the section on agricultural policies in Turkestan and its social and economic implications, analyzes attempts to implement agricultural reforms to boost economic development. In Turkestan, land was officially declared the property of the empire, thus indicating that Russia was a successor of the former regimes. Of course, Russian authorities realized very well that they were not unable to somehow change and get rid of local cultures. Therefore, the discussion on agricultural policies, Turkestan was rich in agricultural products, cotton, silk and orchard plants. Most productive was cotton production. Russian administration was looking at maximum profit from the very beginning, especially what pertains cotton industry. Russian industry needed Central Asian cotton so as to get rid of imported American cotton. Prince Masalsky wrote the following words. Cotton comes number 1 in the list of raw materials for textile production. In the second paragraph, main aspects of Russian industrial policy in Turkestan includes the development of downstream processing industries. In Turkestan, the following agricultural downstream industries were well developed: cotton refining, leather production, meat and dairy. By 1913, Turkestan had over 700 industries with 201 for cotton refineries, 72 for leather processing plants. So cotton production flourished in the country. The third section is devoted to imperial customs policies and its impact on foreign trade. This describes the integration of Turkestan general-governorship into Russian customs system and its consequences, as well as its impact on domestic and foreign trade in Russian Empire. The customs of Turkestan dates back to 1968, when the Orenburg and West Siberian customs lines were eliminated. In 1886, customs oversight was withdrawn from Turkestan governorship and incorporated into the Ministry of Finance. A special envoy for customs had his office in Turkestan. Under the law of the June 12, 1980, Semipalatinsky and Turkestani customs districts were established to control borders with China neighboring Khanates. The head office of Turkestani customs district was located in Tashkent. The Russian Empire aspired to expand its trade relations with Persia and Afghanistan. Russia was focused on manufacture and sugar in terms of its export. Earlier, only 0.01% of local population in Afghanistan could afford Russian textile. Now those account to over 50%. This is what a well-renowned expert Gubarevich writes. Turkestan was a transit country for Russia that traded with Persia and Western China. So Russian Empire wanted to expand its export into the east. And this region, I mean the Central Asia, has in full delivered on these aspirations. Chapter 3 covers financial tax policy of Russian Empire and its impact on the economy as well as the well-being of local population. The first section of this chapter is devoted to fiscal systems reforms in Turkestan general governorship. This section analyzes the financial policies of Russia in Turkestan. Authorities in St. Petersburg insisted that Turkestan covers for its expenses from its own local budget. I should note that financially, Turkestan has always been regarded as a drag. However, the Turkestani local authorities disagreed with this point of view because those believed that Turkestan was overburdened by military expenses. This is what we read in one of the magazines. St. Petersburg deems Turkestan to be a waste for St. Petersburg, to be a drag on its financial system. However, this will go on unless accurate and appropriate fiscal policies are implemented. Local administration wanted to prove that deficit is normal. It was normal for British India as well. This discussion is still there, and it causes lots of disagreement among scholars. The second section discusses the tax policies of Russian administration in Turkestan and its impact and consequences. This section covers the tax rates in Turkestani general governorship and its impact on the development of the country. The tax policies depended on the fiscal policies and the productive forces in Turkestan. general governorship. Russia tried to be soft in terms of its taxation policies so as not to stifle the economic development of the country. On the contrary, Russia aspired to boost its economic development and to impose customs protectionism. Russia was focused on small and medium enterprises without allowing larger enterprises to interfere. In the conclusion, the conclusion reflects the key statements of the thesis. I should note that the key thing of Russian Empire rule in Turkestan was the ideological legitimation, which was reflected in its reforms. I should note that life in Turkestan general governorship depended highly on the reforms implemented. There were lots of debates on social economical life in Turkestan, but those debates were unable to somehow change the imperial policy. On the contrary, those debates reinforced the positions of Russia in Turkestan. I should note that those points of view can be split in two groups, passive and active policies. Both positions had their right, but advocates of passive policies dominated because they had a more clear vision of the future of Turkestan in terms of its social, economic, and financial development. Within these variety of views, the imperial administration was able to reinforce its positions in Turkestan politically and economically. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Mr. Alimdzhanov. Now questions. Questions to the reports. Please, Mr. Rabashin. Thank you very much, Mr. Alimdzhanov. And this is my question. In the beginning of your speech, you mentioned that Russian Empire wanted to preserve a status quo in Turkestan. But in the end, you mentioned that there was some pattern of Turkestani development, economical development, I mean. So those two statements, how are they aligned? Are they aligned to you? How do you match them? Don't they contradict each other? Or, vice versa, there is some contradiction that should be explained? This is my question. Thank you very much for your question, Professor Rabashin. Well, of course, any historical event in its contents, in its essence, has some contradiction. To us, the status quo was exactly the economic model for Turkestan, which implied that the economical relations in the country are preserved with no radical, no dramatic change. Here, I mean by status quo, I mean that there is no competition between modernization and traditional approaches. Quite the contrary, we claim that reforms and modernizations supplemented the traditional policies of Russian Empire in the region. I mean, the status quo was exactly what we mean by the Turkestani pattern of development. I don't see any contradiction here, actually. Are you satisfied with the answer? Yes, in full. More questions? Yes, I have a question. Can I take the floor? Bakhtiyor, in your thesis, quite often you mention that there was a huge basis that Russian administration was supported in Turkestan. So, and you claim that this is reflected in Soviet historiography. But the effect of Turkestani development was that the industries in Russia wanted to gain more from Turkestan, in terms of cotton as well. But I see some contradiction here. Thank you very much for your question. I got it. We should keep in mind that textile industry in Russia started to flourish after Central Asia joined Russia. Why? Why did that happen? This happened because Central Asia was not only a supplier of cotton, expensive cotton, I should say, but this merge between Russia and Central Asia resulted in the fact that Central Asia became one of the customers of Russian textile industry. Therefore, it was profitable for Russia to invest into Turkestani cotton industry because annually Turkestan consumed products, textile products, worth over 160 million rubles. So this means that Turkestan provided raw cotton and bought the end product, the end textile product as a result. So, and therefore, larger textile industries invested resources into Turkestan so that the local population has some money. Therefore, they had to create this market, this demand just from the scratch. So, could you please repeat the question? Could you please repeat the question? The connection is not quite good. What is the influence of Chinese manufacturers on Turkestan? Is it clear? Well, we should keep in mind that it had a positive effect to some degree. It is remarkable that the development of cotton industry did not result in any bourgeois processes, because instead of wheat, cotton was cultivated. So economically, that provided some revenue, that provided some profit to the local population, but it did not change the social structure of a city or of a village. I mean, just the flow of money, the flow of cash increased, but it did not result in any change in tradition socially. I mean, just the resources increased, the cash increased. So the population bought the textiles, they bought tea, and this is how this money was drawn again back to Russia. Another question, but the last one, please. Well, you know well how cotton refineries operated in Turkestan by the beginning of the 20th century. And why did it happen that the textile industry did not develop at all? There were cotton refineries, no textile industries. Could you please repeat the question? We cannot hear, could not hear your question very well. Shall I repeat the question? Yes, please repeat your question once again. So why do you think that textile industry did not develop in Turkestan? Cotton refineries were flourishing. but we don't see any textile industries. Well, first and foremost, Turkestan lacked resources. I mean, just lacked specialists, engineers, workers. Human resources, you know that in the second half of the 19th century, when cotton industry was started to develop from Afghanistan, from Bukhara, there was an outflow of human resources. So Turkestan lacked human resources to establish its textile industry. There were no resources. There were no human resources, no economic resources. There's highly dramatic situation in the second half of the 19th century. This is statement number one. Second, textile industries were located in Moscow and in Poland, which means that they did not want to outsource production. Well, semi-rechia is an exception. It's an unparalleled phenomenon when a textile manufacturer was opened in Turkestan, but it had no future. Well, this is what actually the Soviet government did in the 1930s. Are you satisfied with the answer, Professor Morrison? Well, I see your smile, and I believe you are. Please, colleagues, more questions to our defendant. If no questions, please take your seat. We move over to the second point, and now we have reports. We have 5 reports from all the 5 members of the board. All reports were timely provided according to the existing regulation. They were downloaded to the official website of the state universities. We do not have any external reviews of the dissertation. May I now give the floor to Professor Sergei Abashin. So we are going to move in the Russian alphabet order. Good afternoon, distinguished colleagues. I would like to extend my gratitude for the opportunity to take the floor and to participate in this ceremonious event. The topic of the thesis is highly remarkable. First, it is devoted to the region which has been understudied in historical scholarly tradition. There is increased interest to the history of Turkestan. However, academic papers are few, though Russian Soviet tradition sheds a lot of light on the history of this region so far. Second, it is economical policies in Turkestan that has been undervalued in the existing scholarship. Most of those focused on the invasion of Turkestan in 1898, in 1916, rather than on the policies. So these two trends are highly remarkable, which justifies the relevance of the thesis. The thesis comprises an introduction, 3 chapters, and a conclusion. And the introduction identifies the key challenges and describes the sources. The first chapter looks at the Russian imperial policies and describes the key forces on the arena. The second chapter covers the reforms that were undertaken in the economy. And the third chapter refers to the fiscal policies in Turkestan. In my review, I would like to touch upon a few issues that can facilitate the assessment process. First and foremost, I would like to focus on historiography in the introduction. The very attempt to come up with such a historiographical review to describe the key papers, to identify their advantages and disadvantages, to engage in some kind of debate with these papers. This is an innovative approach indeed. Mr. Alimdzhanov focuses on the social-economic situation in Turkestan and describes the Soviet academic tradition, including the approaches used in these papers. But of course, there are some flaws, there are some gaps. UFAV is undervalued, and a range of other academics. The paper by Kostinskaya is dated wrongly, so it rather belongs to the academic tradition of the pre-military period. I think that the analysis of contemporary international research is undervalued, including the papers by Alexander Morrison, one of the members of the board. I should also note a number of papers by Chipinati, who is engaged into the economy of Turkestan. May I also note that many papers referred to in the introduction are not mentioned in the body of the thesis, which means that there is lack of dialogue, lack of debate, lack of engagement, I should say, to prove the conclusions. Despite all these minor corrections, I believe that overall the thesis is successful, it is logical, and it proves that this is a high-quality research. I would like also to address to the primary resources. It is a plus that the author introduces a lot of archived materials and primary resources. The author refers to the letters of Palin, to the discussions by Fyodorov and Lapin, and comes up with an array of statistical data on Turkestani economy. All this sheds a lot of light on the situation in the region, which is a contribution by itself. However, though, I would advise to be more systematic in describing economical processes. It is recommended to refer to tables more often, because there are as few as 2 tables in this thesis, or to have probably some dynamic graphs, some charts on industries, on production, on cotton prices, as well as tax revenues, tax collection, and contributions into the budget. What we have is some data on 1886 only. It would be successful to use letters of the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century to look at economic reports to describe the society. I should say that research in economics should focus on statistics to a greater extent and be illustrative. It would be interesting to have some more information on specific companies, textile companies or cotton refining companies that existed at that time. And thirdly, I would like to focus on the conclusions. Mr. Alimdzhanov writes that the economic policy was focused on non-intervention and conservation. End of quote. Which means that the key statement is that the Russian Empire was through some reforms and modernization and lacked economic power so as to initiate modernization and reforms in Turkestan, a remote region. Therefore, this the rhetoric of modernization, despite this rhetoric of modernization, Russian Empire followed a conservative tradition. The author claims that the expansion into Turkestan was a drag on the development of capital trends in Russia. Overall, such a view is remarkable and justified to me because it offers lots of explanations to a number of processes. However, I think that the author should be aware of undervaluing the changes that have been budding in Turkestan for the 50 years. When we compared the British India to Turkestan, well, times are different, but the generation is the same. But sometimes we undervalue this very short time span of rule. The author refers to railways, to upstream and downstream industries, irrigation, cotton industries. But this is not mentioned in the conclusion. Some interpretations overlook changes. For example, what we see is that the market relations were not developed in the country, but I believe that in 1886 land was declared as privately owned. That meant private property, which resulted in significant expansion by the beginning of the 20th century. Later, Mr. Alimdzhanov writes that these attempts failed. I think that this is a pessimistic view. If we compare the situation in 1913 versus 1870, 1880s, this means that the cotton industry expanded manifold, becoming a driver in the region. The thesis lacks dynamics. So what we see is just a static situation, just because the structure is so that there are no specific historical periods identified. I think it would be positive to have some comparison with Bukhara and Khiva. If not the other regions of Russia, this remained kind of outside the brackets, outside the limits of this research. Because Bukhara was at the same level, so it would be actually positive to compare those two regions. Is there any status quo in Turkestan versus Bukhara? Or we see more dynamics in Turkestan? I mean, such comparison would make it, would be a plus. I think that the economic changes in Turkestan could be described in greater detail. Reforms, because the reforms in the Soviet times, they did not start off the scratch. They were kind of prepared by the Imperial Russia reforms. Well, good knowledge of historiography and the originality of the topic allows me to give a positive assessment to the thesis. All the recommendations are subject to debate and are mere wishes for future academic endeavors. I believe that this thesis is well enough to be awarded the academic degree of Candidate of Sciences in Global History. May I now give the floor to member of the Defense Board, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Professor Taisia Kitanina. Could you please switch on the mic? Do you hear me? Okay. Distinguished members of the audience, distinguished members of the board. I was so excited to read this thesis, and I was so much satisfied. I liked it so much, and this is what I'm going to speak now. But this does not mean that there are no recommendations, there are no corrections, that there are no flaws. Quite the contrary. I think that would be highly useful for the author. The topic of the research is the economic policy of the Russian Empire in Turkestan in the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century. This is not a uniform issue. The advantage of this thesis is that it is conceptually innovative. It does not repeat the outdated ideas, and there are no conclusions which are not supported by evidence. At the beginning, the introduction of the thesis is a historiographical review which covers historiography of Imperial Russia, of the Soviet Russia, and post-Soviet Russia. I should note that the debate is very elegant and gentle, whereas what we saw in the past was just straightforward criticism of the imperial policies in Central Asia, but quite often did not correspond to the real situation. The author refers to academic writings of Turkestani national academic tradition, which enriches this research. Also, the bibliography mentions the recent theses that have been recently defended. The thesis relies on a solid primary resources basis, including archives. The author covers the archives of the Republic of Turkmenistan and Turkestan, the treasury of Tashkent, the Kokang Stock Exchange Committee, as well as the archives of this Russian state historical archives, including reports by von Kaufmann, by Duke Panin. There is ample statistical data, archives, laws, memoirs, and newspapers. This broad scope of issues covered in the thesis translated into the overall complexity of the objections, a thoughtful approach and a careful approach in drawing conclusions. Well, actually, this is a comprehensive research on the Russian Empire economic policy in Central Asia. This research is based on ample primary resources and historiography. The introduction identifies the key objectives and key statements of the thesis. First, Russia's economic policy was careful and deeply thought through. At the same time, Russia was reluctant to modernize national economy off the scratch. Second, all the debates between the local and the central power authorities were more theoretical rather than practical. Page 31. The political and economical processes in Turkestan that cover over 50 years allow the author to refer to the fact that capital was weak, that there was lack of investment, constant budget deficit, and acute, dramatic lack of capital investments. And therefore comes the observations on the activity of Russian commercial banks that had 40 offices in Central Asia, which is much for Central Asia. Commercial banks did not interfere with the structure of local economy and the existing economic relations that were specific and traditional. I should say that all that was about the pre-capitalist forms of rule. I should note, however, that commercial banks were had high interest, contrary to the European banks that financed industries only. An exception was the colonial bank, not of England, but of Great Britain. On the contrary, Russian banks interfered actively into trade and supervised trade operations and transactions and agricultural products. It is remarkable that the third world countries also had commercial banks in India, in Chile, in Peru. This is what is described by experts in Moscow. In St. Petersburg, we lack such experts. I mean Lipkovsky, Stannikov, and Brodowski on Latin America. So these scholars demonstrated that banks of those countries were very similar in terms of the commercial transactions in agricultural products. My personal observation and research proved that Russian Asian Bank was not only involved in the trade with bread and cotton, but it had ample resources in stock. In particular, may I refer to the fact that its stock of bread was assessed at 4 trillion rubles. This is what was mentioned by an excellent researcher of Russian history in 1928 by Mr. Braley. So this means that the Russian economy was so versatile, and therefore the lack of capital stimulated this dimension in the activities of commercial banks. I believe that this promoted the position of local industries. So the Russian migrants are also mentioned into the thesis. Mr. Alimdzhanov concludes that in terms of culture and economy, Russian authorities were unable to change the situation in Turkestan. I think that here this judgment is subject to a lot of doubt. Of course, there were changes that definitely exercised some impact on the situation. However, we did not see any dramatic changes, but minor changes were there. Mr. Alimdzhanov looks at the land ownership policies and the question of nomads settling down was open. 80% of the population were small landowners, but large landowners were not there. The irrigation system is analyzed as well as the legal conditions of how water was distributed. One of the key subjects of the research is cotton industry. The author justly refers to the facts that prove that cotton had a very high cost, and the measures of the government to lower the costs of cotton are reviewed. One of the measures is the establishment of an integrated economic space, whereas what we see in agriculture is the export and cultivation of cotton. And here we see how the Turkestan is integrated into the Russian agricultural market. According to Alimdzhanov, the agricultural policy promoted the key industries in the metropole. Therefore, Turkestan was supplementary to what we had in Imperial Russia. Well, this is just in its own right. However, we should note that the industrial potential of both Central Asia and Russian Empire was undervalued, it was underdeveloped, as well as the very traditional lack of capital. The discrepancies in industries and their development and the feudal forms of ownership are also noted. With all that in mind, local population was not engaged into industrial relations. It is highly remarkable that what Mr. Alimdzhanov says about customs policies in cotton industry, as well as finances and fiscal policies. The author mentions that there were tax benefits in cotton industry. Cotton was subject to tax on the same conditions as wheat, which means that the conditions are favorable. Page 160. This is a highly remarkable conclusion. I mean, the fact that Turkestan was a drag on Russian economy overall. Thanks to this thoughtful, deep study of the problem, Mr. Alimdzhanov arrives at a well-proved conclusion that Russian Empire in general has found an appropriate solution of how to develop Turkestan. And this is what was mentioned in the introductory word of the speaker. This thesis is highly thought-provoking. And there are, despite all of these advantages, there are some recommendations and corrections. First, national policies of Russian Empire in Central Asia were determined by the fact that Turkestan was not alien to authoritative rule, because Turkestan was represented by long-standing traditions, long-standing ruling traditions. In its national policies, the Russian government relied on the existing aristocracy, which allowed to solve a number of important economic problems. Similar actions were undertaken by larger bank capital, which is proved by financial agreements with heads of these states. So I think it would be right to engage this data. Now I have almost drafted a paper, a highly exciting review of the treaty between Russia and the Emir of Bukhara. And this treaty stipulates on how to divide power between the Bukhara and Russian capitalists. This is a highly exciting treaty, and this is what we have in Russian archives. Second,
обратить внимание на развитие экономики края.
about the development of the economy in the country during the First World War, when Russian industrial capital started to actively interfere into economy. For a long time I have been looking into the First World War, and what we see in 1915 is some kind of an agitation in industries. And it is then that the industrial changes, structural changes in industries and agriculture resulted in large-scale projects. Putilov established 3 railways during the First World War, starting from the 1916. Mining was well developed. Third, I totally agree with Mr. Alimdzanov's assessment of economic policy in terms of cotton. But I cannot but disagree with the fact that the cotton industry has undermined this industry in 1914. Well, you know, this tax was introduced in 1914, and it was introduced due to some impediments, due to a highly difficult situation. This tax was suggested by Kokenian Cotton Committee in 1906, but it was rejected in 1906 and in 1910 by the Russian government. It was reviewed, by the way, by the Council of Ministers. So, which means that Russia was highly careful about boosting cotton industry in Turkmenistan. And lastly, we can see some discrepancies, so it would be favorable to correct those discrepancies. Overall, I should say that this is an original paper, and if we see that the author refers to local papers, to the theses that are almost inaccessible for us, I think therefore this thesis is worth to amount to a publication. Finally, I believe that the thesis is in compliance with all the requirements and it must be approved. Thank you very much. May I now give the floor to our foreign member of the board, Alexander Morrison, Doctor of Philosophy, Professor of the School of Humanitarian and Social Sciences, Nazarbayev University, Astana, Kazakhstan. Mr. Morrison, the floor is yours for 10 minutes. Do you hear me well? Yes, we do. Good afternoon, colleagues. Well, if you don't hear me, if something isn't clear, please just let me know. I will repeat my statement. Well, the thesis was very interesting to me because what this thesis covers is a topic that has been undervalued and understudied in this scholarly tradition. This thesis covers a topic of enormous importance in Central Asian and Russian imperial history, and one that has been consistently neglected in the 25 years since the Soviet collapse. In the ongoing debate over the colonial nature of Russian rule in Central Asia, there has been extensive work in cultural, political, and institutional history. This thesis refers to ample resources, including the Russian State Historical Archive and the Central State Archive of the Republic of Uzbekistan, contemporary publications and periodical literature. But what I see as the ultimate value of the thesis is the rhetoric of economic development. It seems that in theory, I mean, the rhetoric, what we see in newspapers and in documents, is more important than practical measures. There is an ample comparison between Turkestan and the British India. Well, I have some corrections. I overall agree with the most part of conclusions. Those have an ultimate value. But nevertheless, may I introduce my corrections? Very poor hearing into the mic. Very poor sound. There are some flaws in the assessment of these system governors. Well, I should say that this discussion of Russian Empire governance should be more fundamental, including economical aspects. There should be a more active debate with historiographical data. So the overall assessment of the economic policy of Russian Empire in Turkestan and the development of the class stratification in the society, the economical changes. Well, what we do not know as of now is what the quality of life was, whether it has changed, whether the well-being of the local population has increased, has improved within this period under review. This is a very ample and a very complicated question. I think it would be worth discussing it based on what we see in Mr. Alimdzanov's research. Mr. Alimdzhanov mentions lots of historiography and research papers, both in English and Russian, especially in the introduction. But once we start discussing some very specific issues based on the primary sources, there is some lack of dialogue with historiography. And I have read thoroughly the dissertation, but I don't think what is actually Mr. Alimdzanov's opinion on the land ownership strategy in Turkestan. Well, there are some references, some research papers that have not been covered, and it would be favorable to integrate them into the text. And I have included the list of bibliography, which is lacking, in the end of my report. One of the most important part is the agriculture. So the reviews and the resources that are mentioned, those are highly useful, but quite often there are some reiterations, there are some repetitions, and there is lack of analysis. What the author does is just repeating the contents of this primary source. So what I would like to have is more discussion, is more active debate. Including debate on economic policies. And some comparison between the second half of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. But next, well, as for the economical component in Central Asia, I think this is the most important part on the body of the thesis. But some conclusions that drawn by the author are highly debatable. And I believe those are not proved in full, including some economic processes in the border of the 19th and 20th centuries. Very poor sound into the headphones. Interpretation is hardly possible. Well, then, a cotton industry started to expand in Turkestan, and here the customs interfered. And there was some rivalry between Turkestan and the US. Well, customs tariffs were also unfavorable. But this results in a very intriguing question. But there were some people who generated huge revenues. There were cotton refineries. what Alimdzhanov writes is that this benefited the large industries in Moscow. But I think that the situation is different, and we should be more careful about these such statements, which should refer to some technical aspects. And I think that this is what the author should understand and have an insight into. Well, this is just the basics, corrections. I don't know whether you hear me well via this broadcasting, this conference equipment, but what I would like to say is that, well, for the Russian degree of academic degree of a candidate of sciences, this thesis is indeed enough. So it is in compliance with all the rules and requirements. Was it clear to you, Mr. Alimdzhanov? May I now give the floor to Professor Florinsky, Doctor of Historical Sciences. Distinguished Chairman, distinguished members of the Defense Board, a distinguished audience. This thesis is devoted to the topic of high relevance as importance. For hundreds of years, Russia has been sort of an organism, a body of an imperial type. And, well, at least this was its legal status. By the end of the 19th century, Russia has expanded to its natural border so as to integrate highly various, highly versatile regions in terms of its confessions, nationalities, religion, culture. And therefore, this integration into Russian Empire imposed its impact on the further history, which was manifested in the second part of the 19th century, when the modernization was flourishing and it had to face these multiple challenges. One of the problems was the uniformity, the integrity of the empire, some balance between the center and the remote areas. That was one of the most acute issues of that time. Therefore, a deep study of this topic, an insight into some specific circumstances and specific landscapes is highly relevant today. The issue is, what was the position of local population, how their life was influenced after the integration with Russia. And these problems are subject to most heated debates in contemporary historiography. Therefore, the topic of the thesis is in full compliance with the requirements. May I note the originality of this thesis? Well, of course, after Turkestan was integrated with Russian Empire, economically, financially, this issue has been very well studied by both Russophone and Anglophone academics. However, not all of the aspects of Russian imperial economic policies have been covered so far. Well, in particular, may I note the agricultural sector, which is highly undervalued. And therefore, this thesis kind of complements on these existing flaws. It is a follow-up to the gaps that we have. Moreover, the studies of the Soviet time are highly apologetic and ideological and therefore distorted. The key advantage of this research is that it is highly balanced and it provides a review of a number of positions. May I underscore that the basis of resources is highly ample and exhaustive. Many non-published resources are integrated into the academic tradition for the first time. Very in-depth analysis ensured the justified nature of the conclusions. The structure of the thesis is in compliance with the structure of research of that status. One of the key advantages of the thesis is the fact that, once again, may I repeat, that it is an in-depth, a thorough historiographical analysis. The bibliography includes Russophone, Uzbekophone, and Anglophone papers. The author provides a very well-weighed assessment and evaluation at every statement by looking at the advantages and weaker points of the research and primary resources. This analysis allowed to establish some horizons for an original research. By looking at the aspects of Russian Empire economic policies, the author describes in full the situation in the region after Russian invasion, all through up to the beginning of the 20th century. Lots of facts that have been unknown before are analyzed, which complement our existing knowledge. When we assess the approaches of the authorities, the author shows that there was some difference in the assessment of the situation between central authorities and local authorities. And what is remarkable of this thesis is that there are lots of comparisons that allows us to have a deeper insight into the nature of phenomena under review, including the comparison with the Indian, British India or French colonies. There are a lot of facts about agricultural policies, and for the first time we see how Russian imperial agricultural policies influenced the situation in Turkestan. Most conclusions are justified, and the agricultural policies of Russian Empire has a positive assessment overall. May I note that there is a specific section devoted to finances, which were highly and closely related to agricultural policies. I should note that our author was in a very difficult situation, because there was a thesis published on a similar topic and defended in 2006. However, the author, Mr. Alimdzhanov, does his research again, and he managed to identify some aspects that were understudied in the thesis that dates back to 2006, and managed to come up with lots of original information and conclusions. So therefore, the author managed to supplement what was already done by his fellow scholar. Therefore, I believe that this thesis is an important contribution. The primary resources basis is ample. However, it would make this research even more complete if there were documents and reports by the Council of Ministers included. I think that the review of resources is too short, less than 3 pages, and the classification of resources does not correspond to our academic tradition. Well, this is not a reprimand or a reproach, but I think that such a new approach, such a different approach, which deviates from the tradition, should be justified, but I don't see any justification in this respect. On page 55, Russian policy in Turkestan is described as liberal and conservative. But what's meant by that? Because this notion is very well known in politology, so I think that this definition seems strange and it's not justified. On page 56, what we see is that in the 19th century, Russia had ideological parties. What do you mean by the rule of ideological parties? What we see also here is that the bureaucracy in Russia has not undergone any modernizations until 1917. Well, I cannot agree with this statement because there were reforms in 1905 when Russia became a constitutional monarchy. Page 75, the author says that the modernization failed, but there are no further justification or description of this statement. Sometimes the names of the offices are different. There is some discrepancy. Either it is a Minister of Agriculture or it is the Minister of Agriculture and Land. So there is no uniformity. I think that this uniformity is due to the fact that the names of offices used to change, but anyway, this should be mentioned. Nevertheless, all these corrections are just minor and do not undermine the results. There is no doubt that the thesis has a huge practical importance and relevance. As for the overall assessment, well, it is done on a high professional level and it is in compliance with all the requirements to such research, whereas the author of this research deserves the academic title of the candidate of historical sciences. Thank you very much, Mr. Florinsky. And my final review. Turkestan general-governorship that comprised Serdayinsky and Semirechinsky districts was approved by Imperial authorities of Russia by a relevant degree. It included the lands of Russian or the so-called Western Turkestan, which later was named as Middle Asia and Central Asia in post-Soviet period. The borders of Turkestan governorship expanded in 1868. The Zarafshansky district was formed and it transformed into Samarkand region in 1886 and 1876. The Kokand Khanate was transformed into Fergan region. Finally, in 1897-98, the Turkestan region, including the Trans-Caspian region, with the center in Ashgabat. the official historiography in post-Soviet Russia is on an academic periphery. However, there is ample research in Central Asian countries. This thesis reflects all the range of historiography, both in Russia and the West, dating back to the middle of the 19th century. There are both international papers, national historiography of sovereign countries of Central Asia, as well as Russian archives and papers. Economy in Western and Russian Turkestan is covered. Moreover, I should note that the thesis also covers the commercial banks. Railways and commercial banks played a key role in Turkestan modernization, and those should be reviewed in more ample detail. Mr. Alimdzhanov also undervalued the development of trade. Mr. Alimdzhanov, in his research of economic policy of Russia, looks at the primary sources that are not involved into academic tradition, including the RGIA and the archives of the Republic of Uzbekistan, Tsgar Rus, whereas other archives of Central Asian countries in the Republic of Kazakhstan, the Kyrgyz Republic, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan are not used and undervalued. I think it would be better to include those data into the body of the thesis. What we see is the description of the geography and the two terms, the discrepancy between the two terms, Central Asia and Middle Asia. I think it would be more favorable to substitute those terms into Turkestan in general. The text includes 3 chapters. The first chapter describes Russian invasion in the second part of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, as well as the military and political processes in the region of Turkestan. The key focus is the Russian administration, the emergence of schools, and local educated classes. It is highly debatable whether Russian foreign policy played a supportive and extra role to solve its tasks in the southern and eastern Europe. Well, if we follow the logic of the author, we should believe that Turkestan was necessary for Russian Empire so as to press greater powers in finding a rapid solution to the Eastern question. It is highly debatable in the second paragraph of the first chapter whether there was some contradiction between local and imperial administrations across economic and political issues in Turkmenistan general-governorship. I think that such contradictions have been always there. It is not always that Russian military department looked up to the recommendations of other departments. It is remarkable how the author tries to explain the imperial ideology by the rivalry between those who favored Slavic culture and those who favored Western culture. But I believe that the very statement on conservation of economic relations does not offer enough explanation. I mean, the non-interference into the ideological and religious life, this is what the author of the thesis relies on. But this thesis is subject to ample doubt. The second chapter on agricultural policy manifests that the key tool are the works, are the letters and reports by Palin, Krivoshein, and Goes. And finally, the third chapter, the thesis is divided into 2 paragraphs, and it covers the financial and tax policy of St. Petersburg and Turkestan general-governorship. To us, this review is highly successful because it shows that Russian Empire was a dynamically developing political structure. This dynamics was manifested in the relations and in the policies of Russian Empire in Turkestan, as well as other border remote regions, including the soft tax policies. Finally, the tolerance of the Orthodox administration towards Muslims, this is also reinforced. Russian Empire made it favorable and attractive on the international arena. I believe that the author was highly aware of all these finer details. We agree with the fact that the so-called Turkestani model of economic development has reinforced the positions of Russian Empire economically and politically, and this is how, this is what makes the end of the conclusion. I believe that the review dissertation is highly remarkable for its originality and the high professionalism, as well as the depth of theoretical research. The key statements are justified in the... Mr. Alimdzhanov always refers to a resource and justifies his conclusions. On the basis of the thesis, 4 papers were prepared and published in relevant journals, included into the list of the Higher Attestation Commission. Everything above mentioned proves the fact that the thesis under review devoted to the economic policy of the Russian Empire and Turkestan general governorship, second half of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, is in full compliance with the decree as of 1.09.2016, number 6821/1, on the procedure of entitling academic degrees in St. Petersburg State University, and Mr. Alimdzhanov deserves the degree of the Candidate of Sciences in History, specialty Global History. Thank you very much for your attention. May I now give the floor to the defendant. Please, your response to the reports and the commentaries and recommendations. May I extend my gratitude to the distinguished experts, to my teachers and supervisors for their reports, for their recommendations and corrections, for their wise advice. I will incorporate them in my future academic endeavors. May I focus on each of them in short, and I will try to provide all your recommendations with a satisfactory response. I agree with all the commentaries provided by Mr. Abashin, but may I refer to the article 255. Legally, this article covered such a notion as private ownership, which impeded market relations. This article functioned so as to consolidate the acting practices. As a result, the economical processes totally depended on the local population. I will take into account the rest of your recommendations. Madam Kitanina, I accept all of the recommendations and I will incorporate them in my future academic endeavors. I will keep in mind your recommendations on when I will be working on my thesis to publish it. I'm highly grateful to Professor Morrison. Professor Morrison has rightly mentioned the fact that there is lack of rhetoric, but the key correction provided by Dr. Morrison is based on a different concept. Both there are some corrections as to the volume of the thesis. I read your review with high attention, and therefore may I now provide you with some response. Both my thesis was prepared according to the regulations and the requirements of the state, St. Petersburg State Universities. All the quotations and references are in accordance with the requirements provided by the High Attestation Commission. I believe that the overall economic situation in Russia has improved in quantitative terms. The third question on cotton, Turkestan was not only the provider of raw cotton, but also the customer. Fourth, Dr. Morrison notes that Western papers are undervalued in my thesis, but my objective was not to engage into debate with Western historiography. I incorporated the research that was in full compliance with the topic of the reports. I should note that Western scholars quite often undervalue existing papers written by scholars in Uzbekistan or Turkmenistan. But in the future, I will study the bibliography that you provided. Fifth, I should also note that the local population had some privileges. When they were provided with passports, they had a job in local administration, they had a right to address courts. Sixth, Dr. Morrison offers his own vision of modernization in Turkestan. But our vision is different. We want to disembark from the binary model. We want to show that the imperial economy was based on traditional values, whereas modernization reinforced the economy. There was no contradiction. Those served as two sides of a coin. What we see is just a difference in opinions and difference in approaches. To us, it is important that Russian Empire managed to find an appropriate solution that was satisfactory to all the parties. But I believe that a fruitful discussion between advocates of these two approaches would make a contribution. I agree with all the recommendations provided by Professor Florinsky. Professor Shaginian, I agree with all your recommendations, and in my future research I will review the activity of commercial banks in Turkestan, and I will stay aware of the corrections. We suggest that the invasion of Turkestan was a threat to British interests in Iran and India. And this is what emerged during the Berlin Congress. Then Britain was highly endangered. And therefore, the separation of Pamir and the treaty between Russia and England, which was established, the Entente, we believe that to some extent this promoted Russia and enhanced Russian foreign policies. Thank you very much to all the experts. In the future, I will deliver on all the commentaries and corrections. Thank you very much, Mr. Alimdzhanov. Now open discussion. And I would like to ask my colleagues who are in the Defense Board whether they have any feedback to the responses provided. Do they agree? Are they satisfied? Yes. Mr. Morrison, are you satisfied with the response? Are you satisfied with the response? Well, again, there is a smile. Thank you. Thank you so much. So the open discussion. In the open discussion, we welcome whatever contributions. Once again, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the session, please introduce yourself for the protocol and then take the floor. Are there any those who are willing to take the floor? But make sure you do not speak up more than 5 minutes. Just be very short. No contributions. Well, if I see no members of the audience who would like to take the floor, but please just a 5 minutes break. I'm sorry, colleagues. Well, we should give the floor to the academic supervisor. Please, Director of the Institute of History, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Professor Daudov. Distinguished Chairman of the Thesis Defense Board, distinguished members of the Defense Board, colleagues, today I feel so much satisfied by the fact that we see fruitful results and a really positive response of Mr. Alimdzanov's enormous hard work. And what we see today is this groundbreaking format of the defense under the rules of St. Petersburg State University. May I note that Mr. Alimdzhanov came to me with some historical vision, with some historical data and an interest. Therefore, he was very easy to cooperate. Moreover, he already had some research skills, some academic skills, which very much allowed him to be so much successful at the defense today. This topic was a follow-up to his previous research. It was him who offered to consider Russian Imperial economic policy in Turkestan general-governorship. So we just adopted it to the most remarkable, most burning problems, including land policies, financial policies, taxation policies. And it was highly important, highly vital that Mr. Alimdzhanov was very well informed on the internal landscape in the region. He was very well informed on the resources and publications, and therefore he managed to engage innovative archived materials and documents, as well as to consolidate his own opinion by identifying new processes that have not been brought into the academic historical tradition so far. To compare Mr. Alimdzanov's research to the previous thesis that I used to supervise, I should note that Mr. Alimdzhanov has very skillful ability to draw conclusions, to generalize and to analyze. Another positive fact is that Mr. Alimdzhanov is always very gentle about all the recommendations, but he is always ready to interpret these recommendations and to come up with his own original interpretation. And therefore he was able to provide such an independent and original and complete research. I'm highly grateful to everyone present here, to the members of the Defense Board for their contribution, for their time. and for their effort to review and discuss this thesis. First and foremost, may I extend my gratitude to Russian colleagues, to Alexander Morrison, and to Mr. Abashin. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Professor Daudov. Now may I declare a break. So no online broadcasting during the break. 5 minutes break. Thank you.
Глубоко уважаемые коллеги и гости, прошу всех занять свои места.
Colleagues, please take your seats. The meeting is resumed. There are a few aspects left, so please be patient.
Продолжаем. Итак, заседание открытое.
We resume the session now. Open voting. Open voting by names. And the question that to be voted is the entitlement of the thesis to the academic degree of the candidate of historical sciences. So the resolution is positive if more than 2/3 of the board have voted positively. So let's vote in the Russian alphabet order. Mr. Abashin, I'm in favor. Madam Kitanina, in favor. Mr. Morrison, I'm in favor. I support the positive solution. Professor Florinsky and Chairman, I'm in favor as well. Thus, there is the unanimous resolution. May I now read the conclusion, the decision of the Defense Board on the thesis of Mr. Alimdzhanov on the topic Economic Policy of the Russian Empire in Turkestan General-Governorship, second half of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, presented for the candidate of Historical Sciences, specialty 070003, Global History, on January 17, 2017, Universitetskaya Embankment 11. We have a relevant act provided by Morrison, Kitanin, Abashin, Florinsky, and this composition of the Defense Board is approved by a relevant decree. The decision is that the thesis by Mr. Alimdzhanov on economic policy of the Russian Empire and Turkestan General-Governorship, second half of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, is full compliance with all the requirements to the thesis of the candidate of historical sciences as of the decree in September 2016, and in compliance with the criteria to the candidate of historical sciences, specialty global history. The defendant presented 4 papers published in the list of Higher Attestation Commission, no publication in Scopus and web collections. The result of the open voting, reflected in the protocol, allows the defense thesis to award Mr. Alimdzhanov the academic degree of the candidate of historical sciences, specialty 070003, Global History, in accordance with the requirements to such research. The procedure has not been flawed. Are there any commentaries to the conclusion? Mr. Morrison, do you have any recommendations as to the text of the conclusion? Mr. Morrison? No, could you please repeat your question? I'm sorry. Do you have any recommendations as to the decision of the Defense Board? No, no recommendations. Thank you so much. Distinguished Mr. Alimdzhanov, if you would like, you can take the floor. If you would like to for a final address. If not, may I now declare the meeting of the Defense Board adjourned. Thank you very much for the participation.